go.
I'll share my
There we go.
screen now as well.
Okay.
I can manage to do that.
We are recording.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
All
and
right.
thank you very much for the invitation to present
Well,
as part of this series. It's a
pleasure to
really
have you here. Let me introduce you. We have
oh
we have our own homegrown. We've got Dr. Andrew Powers presenting this special seminar for the Geographies of Risk special seminar series. I had the distinct pleasure of finally sitting down over at least virtual screens with Andy to talk about his work at long last, for the podcast project, and it was fantastic. And I had a good time anyway, and I learned a lot, and students really engaged with the material as well. And so it's a pleasure to have you step through the concept and sort of map out what for a lot of people I think is probably an invisible geography of risk that you'll explain as Caringscapes, but it's especially relevant now under the current, under the pandemic, and also in a sort of an austerity and post-austerity landscape, as you will explain. But it's a pleasure to have you, and I'm very glad to be adding this to the seminar series. So thank you, Andy.
okay, well, thank you very much. Yeah, so I've kind of broadly defined or labeled this presentation Caringscapes and Risk, and given it's as part of the seminar series on risk, I just thought I should briefly have a disclaimer that there is an inherent risk here that there might be kind of young people running through this room at any minute. So, please bear with me. And looking at the first slide here, this may reflect perhaps my mood back just at the start of lockdown 3. It's kind of it's quite a bleak picture I've chosen, but it really kind of reflects the way in which voluntary support has had to continue to operate. And I'll kind of explain the post-austerity landscape in which it's situated. I also use the term Caringscapes, which is not my own term that I've coined, but is part of the informal care literature, which I'll also explain. But throughout, I also want you to think about risk in a more, more of as as a feeling of precarity, and I will explain, the understanding of risk as this unsettled, unfinished context in which to in which to work and practice. Okay, so briefly, I thought it's worth highlighting some of this work that I'm drawing on Caringscapes. And if you had seen the podcast or listened to it, I should say, it's myself and Eli, I was trying to describe the way in which, each of our social relational encounters that we have with people in our lives very much are part of our Caringscapes. So we can, of course, think about our family members, so those who we care for and care for us. But also you can begin then to think about your wider social ecology. So, your neighbors, friends, extended family. And then you can kind of extend to a wider scale and think about the ways in which those networks are shaped by, broader kind of landscapes of, of funding that's available, local, government policy. So let's just start then with, the very, very core definition of care. It's defined broadly as physical and emotional labor. And David Conradson's work, and for those of you who've been around Southampton long enough will recall that David Conradson was a geographer at Southampton for some time, but moved back to New Zealand. But he's done a lot of work on the geographies of care, and a key point that he's highlighting here is that it's not just the physical labor of involved in people's care relationships, but also the emotional labor. And indeed, a lot of the care literature has shown that in many cases people carry out care or caring for someone, even in situations where they may not care about the person. So some people may be forced into care relationships, due to changing family dynamics, older age, where all of a sudden a care demand is kind of placed upon you. And there is also some literature which has really kind of helped extend that to think about how we care for non-human entities and care for the environment. Okay, so particularly for those working in environmental science, physical geography, there's some work which really extends that work into those fields. So Caringscape very much refers to those individuals' relationships, or the organization of individuals' caring activities across time and space. And I've got in brackets not solely the home, because I think it's important that we also appreciate a lot of care takes place outside the home. Indeed, it can take place in the work environment as well. Okay, so employees, offering support to each other. But of course, those relationships are kind of tied to available resources, services that are themselves, shaped by wider shifts in the economy, in government policy, and that's where work, particularly Sophie Balby's work, that she's provided this framework for understanding how individuals' caringscapes are shaped by a wider carescape. And this is where she's referring to this, the resource and service context. Okay, so it's really kind of what another person has described as nested dependencies, that these individuals' relationships are defined by these wider contexts. In parallel to geographies of care work, there's a significant body of work on the geographies of voluntary sector, and of course care is also provided collectively. Okay, so in addition to these individual dyads, and the voluntary and community sector, so non-governmental organizations or third sector organizations. And again, David Conradson has worked in this, and Christine Milligan and others. So I'm going to look more at this collective level type of care. So really looking at the role of the voluntary and community sector, and to think about what kind of risk is kind of embedded within in the provision of care from this sector. This is a photo I found. It's from the local examiner from Huddersfield, and it's a photo from the 1980s showing a local MENCAP annual summer day trip. And you can see there, in the foreground, they've got a sliced pan. They've obviously someone's been to the supermarket to buy a picnic for the day. And these kind of local, community-based or voluntary support or forms of support really kind of began to become colonized or increasingly recognized by the government, particularly from the late 1970s. So the voluntary sector, it began to be regarded as a panacea from the late 1970s. So particularly given the fiscal crises at that time, of course, in the UK context, as well as in the US, the voluntary sector was really seen as a way for governments to address the fiscal crises. So rather than being kind of core providers of care and support for adult social care, for example. We saw increased outsourcing with statutory grant funding and expectations for voluntary organisations to provide support services. So Jennifer Walsh subsequently referred to this as the growth of the shadow state, where questions were raised over the closer relationship that began to evolve between the voluntary sector and the government. So fast forward then, so certainly the shadow state is still with us. Over the past decade, social care provision for older, for disabled people, for people with mental ill health, has been subject to declining public investment. And over the last decade of austerity, we've certainly seen a lot of cutbacks to the sector. We are now supposedly in a post-austerity period. So just before the current administration, before Boris Johnson, there was a declaration that austerity was over. And Ruth Rayner is making the point that the impacts of austerity are still with us. The withdrawals, the cuts, they continue to persist, but austerity has lost its discursive and effective usefulness for government. Okay, so they've decided, right, we're not going to refer to this anymore as austerity. What this has meant then for the voluntary sector was a key kind of part of what I was interested in. So given the increased expectations, there's been a small body of research which has shown that voluntary organizations have had to do more with less. So as they face cutbacks to their grant funding. But work by Clark and Newman I found particularly relevant with, in helping to understand this context. So they refer to an unfinished and unsettled field. And they're using this to characterize how it was increasingly difficult for the government to get that consent for austerity, for people to buy in to the austerity agenda. So if you recall at the start of austerity, it was all about we're all in this together. We need to tighten our bootstraps, and tighten our belt. Indeed. So I guess the point here is just that I was kind of interested in drawing on this idea of unfinished and unsettled field to characterize, what it must feel like to work in the voluntary sector during this time. So recent work on the relational geographies of the voluntary sector. So going back to this idea of the Caringscape and thinking about, all the different relationships that are embedded within voluntary sector geographies. And within that, we've got increased bureaucratic regulation, expectations to be more of a professionalized service with training, greater expectations over service delivery and coverage, and indeed redefined relationships with those that they are supposed to care for. Okay, so the voluntary sector then looks very, very different to what it would have looked like in that kind of the pre-panacea period, where it was much more kind of community, organic context. So our study, I've just tried to characterize the broader context and some of the literature that has already explored this context. But one key objective that our study was keen to address was to examine, well, how community support organizations for and by people with learning disabilities are evolving and sustaining their social care support within this context. Okay, so we were really trying to get a sense of the organizational dynamics, how support organizations were coping, how they were dealing with the risk of reduced funding. So we looked at 4 case study areas in the UK. So 2 in England, 2 in Scotland, 1 urban and 1 rural in each. We interviewed 7 local authority representatives. So this is a key stakeholder because they have the responsibility to try and shape the social care market. So they commission, give grant funding to organizations. So remember, they've withdrawn their direct support provision. So their responsibility is really to funnel government funding to local, voluntary and private sector organizations. So we were interested in talking with organizations as well. So 29 organizations we looked at. And we also went along and attended their activities and meetings and events at 8 of these organizations. Okay, so as part of our research, we were really interested in how voluntary organizations were established in the first instance. Okay, so during the interviews, we heard many origin stories about how the organizations had emerged within this context. But as part of our study, we found some of those organizations that we interviewed had been around for longer than the last 10 years. So Charlotte, for example, is reflecting on how things would have been back in the day, she talks about. So before austerity, where she talks about you could go to your partnership board, which was as part of the local authority, with an idea for a project and maybe get 30 grand or something to develop an idea, so really to show that very close relational aspect. So contrast that then to, more recently. So this was an organization, Community Day Activities, which was established in 2008. So although it predates the 2008 fiscal crisis, nonetheless, it was obvious, at least to Margaret, that at that time funding was drying up. It was a very different political context at the time. Do you sink or do you swim? And in this case, we've got a participant who shared with us how she invested her own money into the local voluntary project that she had developed, and completely had to, make a physical building fit for purpose as part of a kind of a day activity center. Okay, so the earlier example kind of talks or refers to that context of starting out and the challenges of trying to set up a voluntary sector organization at this time. We also found then that for organizations who had been around for a longer period, also talking about the challenge of trying to kind of expand out to other local authorities, where this participant, Andrew, he was a manager of an organization called Good Neighbours, and it's based on this idea that local neighbours, so you could identify 7 people in a neighborhood, and they have a community support worker, so they have learning disabilities, but they're living in the community, and they form a network. So a lot of they offer peer support to each other. So it's a very cost-effective model, and you can see in the quote here he's referring to the fact that they could save the local authority £10,000. So the problem is, as you can see in the quote, it's very difficult for the local authority to even give a small nominal grant of £2,000 to just give the organisation to get set up. Okay, so this really kind of highlights the challenge that local authorities know that there are more cost-effective models that they could invest in, but because their funding is so tied up in their statutory care provision, it's very, very difficult to, to support these more preventative, community-based initiatives. So to really kind of help expand on that point, as I said, we also interview commissioners, and it's really interesting to hear from their perspective, because you can see in this quote that they're acknowledging this very situation. So Charles is saying, yes, the challenges of funding has meant that the focus, so most of their funding, is meeting our statutory duties. Okay, and by statutory duties, it basically means that the very kind of core provision that they're for the various highest eligibility for those who have got the highest care needs. So often that involves large private sector residential care providers. So if they've a statutory duty to look after people with these very high care needs. And what happens then, they've very little money left to try and support the more preventative types of initiatives which we heard about. Okay, so the preventative services from voluntary organizations you're forever defending. Okay, so there's a key acknowledgement here that, as well as the voluntary sector, there's a very kind of clear normalizing of the situation within the voluntary or within the local authorities as well. I chose the following quote just to illustrate the range of different types of funding sources that these voluntary organizations have to rely on. So I've actually highlighted in the quote here, we've been funded by, and they list off a whole range of different, small grant funding sources. So MENCAP, People's Health Trust, Lloyd's Community Health Foundation Trust, a water supplier. And then we get lots of little bits of grants from them, Comic Relief. So we've got, at any one time, we could have 20 funders who all want reporting and writing. So this really gives you an insight into the kind of everyday operation of a voluntary organization. Within the current context, they can't solely rely on a local authority grant, although a small proportion of that certainly comes through from those. And then you hear, towards the end of the quote about how they have to rely on, very small grants. So it's hand to mouth, and I think most charities would say the same. So if you're thinking about risk and how this context relates to risk, this is a very kind of normalized kind of a part of their everyday operation, that it's hand to mouth. So you can see that very clear account of the precarity of the organizations that are operating. So I was interested in returning to that idea of unfinished and unsettled field, to try and characterize that sense of risk and vulnerability. And Charlotte, an advocate who's worked in the adult social care sector for a long time, talks about how that has changed the very nature of working within this context. So she's saying, we all know the cheapest wins, so you're cut down and down and down. And conversations are always about how can we get our hourly rate down? How can we do more hours with less money? Our staff are so tight at the moment and have been for ages. It's not what most people think of being a charity environment. It's a pile of caseloads. It's really high pressure, and that's what the lack of money does. And it's totally transformed organizations from being value-driven, volunteering organizations to being low-cost businesses. And that concerns all of us, really. Okay, so what Charlotte is suggesting here, that we're seeing a new hybrid form of organization that's emerging, that really comprises the voluntary, state-like and private sector characteristics. Okay, so I'll expand on that reflect on that in the conclusions. So the managers that we spoke to, they reflected on the precarity of their organizations. So that idea of being operating hand to mouth. But the risk of closure constantly just appeared to be at least partially normalized within their working practices. But our findings also illustrate that sustaining their provision is not just about funding. Okay, although that was a key part of our focus. But our study also really kind of identified the amount of energy, commitment, learning, but also the building of knowledge. Identifying key future leaders who could work in this sector. And thinking about passing on the knowledge of how to kind of operate, and also being valued. As I said in the last slide, that we're seeing this kind of hybridization, that these organizations are adopting characteristics of local businesses, private businesses, whilst also trying to maintain that ethos of a voluntary organization. Okay, that original charity ethos, particularly for people, to be driven by the needs and wishes of those that they serve. So while I can accept, that there are certainly arguments that have been made that austerity was necessary at that time, big question mark, but nonetheless there was a deficit. And the problem that we've really tried to grapple with, though, is that throughout this entire period, we've seen the state's continued reliance on the sector. So indeed, that very early panacea moment of saying, right, the voluntary sector, we need to channel funds to that. They're going to be way more cost effective if they provide the support. But all of that funding context has completely changed. But nonetheless, that reliance on the sector has remained and persisted throughout that time. Okay, so this is the key problem, that we have to grapple with. Is it fair? Is it realistic to to continue to rely on the sector in such a way? Returning then to Clark and Newman's unfinished and unsettled field. In their paper, they argue that if people are forced to continue to occupy this field, that they begin to become disaffected, they become unsatisfied, uncommitted, disgruntled, and perhaps disengaged. Okay, so in their characterization, they argue that people's kind of willingness to commit will become whittled down. People will become less engaged. But from our research, we've really kind of pointed to something else, that we're seeing these kind of strange expressions of being disaffected with the current context and committed, disgruntled and engaged, agitating and compliant. Okay, and we saw some examples of agitating local authorities and trying to challenge and transform that context. And then final point, that occupying this hybrid space offers some limited scope for managers to both agitate and challenge, but also to foster the relationships in which their organizations operate. Okay, so if you recall one of the earlier slides, Andrew from Good Neighbours talked about trying to get £2,000 from the local authority. And we heard later in the interview that he was ultimately successful, in trying to expand out to other local authorities. So that is the reality, that we are seeing examples of these organizations fostering relationships with local authorities. And we can see that local authorities are themselves really seeking to try and carve out some space for this preventative type of work. So that hopefully characterizes the kind of hybrid, challenging space in which these organizations occupy. And certainly, I hope that gives you quite a nuanced account of the geographies of risk within, you know, a specific context like this. So I will finish there. I'll hopefully get to return, to the main screen.
Thank you so much for that. And I am happy to, I will moderate, but I'm happy to turn the floor over to questions. If you'd like to ask a question following up on this seminar, please use the little raise my hand icon and we'll come get you. The floor is open. Let's see.
Hi, Rachel.
Yes, Rachel.
Sorry, I think I clicked on the wrong thing. Sorry.
Oh, that's all right.
Still not very good at this. Thanks, Andy. That was, sorry, I should put my camera on as well, shouldn't I? That was really, really interesting, Andy. Thank you. It's actually really great. Andy is one of my supervisors. It's actually really, really great to hear a bit more about your work. I was wondering, Andy, how long did the project run for? And did you see much turnover in the organisations? Because my experience, as you know, from, you know, and sometimes working in these sorts of places and alongside them, is that unfortunately that precarity means that you lose a lot of really good staff, because you never know how long you're going to have a job for. I mean, I've, you know, had that experience, you know, of trying to apply for a mortgage, you know, when working for a mental health charity, and you don't sort of get the security that, you know, other sectors of your life need. So did you find that was much of an issue, that staff talked about losing staff and losing good staff because of that precarity and the risks in their own lives? You know, it's the risk of losing the funding, but it's also the risk of what that means to them as individuals. They are, after all, just, you know, they're trying to make a living as well.
Yeah, we certainly found lots of examples of that. And also that expectation to find volunteers was something that was evident. So some of the organizations talked about paid volunteer roles, which they could fund for, you know, if they got money for a small project, they could fund a volunteer for 6 months, for example. And, you know, this small source of funding is tied to a very specific project that has to be reported on, and they get to hire someone for, I don't know, 8 to 12 months to do that. That runs out, you know, and they have to look for funding to run it again, or, you know, so that certainly was evident in our across the research. A lot of organizations talked about the high turnover, and indeed some of the local authorities that we spoke to were identifying places or organizations within their area that they, according to them, were really innovative. And over the course of the study, which was 2 years, that those organizations folded. You know, so on the one hand, you'd the local authority saying, you know, this was a great model of community support, and in the very same breath, then, you know, hearing about it being running out of funding.
Yeah, it's so sad, isn't it? And sometimes and you did talk about this in your talk, but the very the reporting and the goals and everything that are then imposed from above, crushing the actual innovation and spirit and that those organizations are, you know, are capable of, and how you find that balance between, yes, you need to show that you're using the money honorably, but without it then crushing the very thing that you're trying to achieve. But thank you. All right, I'll try and lower hands or whatever else I need to do.
Other questions? I'll pose one in the meantime, maybe
Yeah,
to
sure.
bring some people out of the weeds here. With do you think there will be space for sort of cultural space, societal interest in sort of bringing back more of a social democracy in the way that, like one that supports public services? Is there going to be, is there hope? I'll play my card. Is there hope for a return from the hard swing toward free market privatization that typifies sort of the austerity approach, and to bring those social services back into government?
It's funny because during that kind of if you think of that post-war welfare settlement period, what emerged was large kind of institutional provision of care, not only in kind of large care settings, but also the very kind of basis of community care was very kind of formalized, static, very difficult to be personalized, and the disabled people's movement really challenged that and developed what became known as person-centered support or personalization. So they kind of advocated for more choice and control over care. So there's been some work that has suggested that while that introduced a lot of benefits for people, unfortunately, it's been coined as the right policy at the wrong time. That kind of emerged at the same time as this, drive to cut back on funding, and has really undermined that personalization agenda. So I certainly wouldn't advocate a shift back to that kind of kind of personalized care context, because people were understandably seeking to challenge that. So what I would kind of advocate would be recognition of the conditions that are required for this to flourish, and to to recognize the work within the community and voluntary sector, and that certainly was the case for some of the over the last 30 years, some of that period where organizations, which I remember in one of my earlier slides referred to that, where organizations felt that they could set up projects and really evolve and sustain themselves. So certainly that's been undermined.
Thank you for answering my question. It's any others from the audience? And going once, going twice, because otherwise we can
People are keen to grab a sandwich, I guess.
Yeah, right. Well, then if I see no hand popping up. So Andy, thank you so much for your time today, and for recording this seminar, and we will add it to the others to stand as resources for the future. If you missed it now, you can catch it later. But it's great to hear you discuss this and articulate these nuances, and thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. So have a good weekend, everyone. Thanks for your time. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Andy. Great talk.
Thank you, Dr.